Firstly, I'd just like to thank you all for having me here today on International Women's Day. It's quite a privilege to be talking in front of all of you very successful women here. So I'll give you a brief introduction of who I am and what I do. My name's Natalie McGloin. At 16 years old, I was injured in a car crash and I broke my neck at C6-7, which means I'm paralysed from the chest down. Now, that means that I've got no movement or sensation below my level of injury. It also, my disability affects my hands, if you can see, which is common with a neck break. Another thing, an interesting fact might be about me, that I am a racing driver. I race cars against able-bodied men. When I talk to people about what I do, they often ask me how I got into motor racing, how I got into cars. And the answer is quite simple. Someone told me not to. When I was 22, I decided that I'd like to buy a sports car. And I went to Porsche garage. And I decided that I might quite like a Boxster. Now, a Boxster is their smaller sports car. It's not massively quick, but it's quick enough. So I went in and I had a look at the car, made sure I could get in and out of the car, that my wheelchair fit, and I was quite happy with my choice. It was cute, I thought it suited me, and I was going to go away and be content with my choice. Whilst I was in the dealership, I also noticed their 911 car, which is the car you can see there. I didn't really know much about the car at the time. It was slightly bigger. It probably suited my needs a little bit better as it has 2 seats in the back. It's their more powerful model. But I didn't really like it. I didn't like the look of it. Didn't really think it suited me. And I went away from the dealership thinking I'd order the other model that I'd seen. I went to my friend's house the following day and told him about my car shopping experience. I talked to him about the Boxster. I mentioned the 911. He stopped me in my tracks and said, "Don't be so ridiculous. The 911 is a driver's car. You won't be able to handle it." So I went back to Porsche the following week and I put an order in for one, just to prove him wrong. I always say that I'm quite stubborn. It's probably my biggest strength and my biggest weakness. So you'd probably think that when I was 16 and I broke my neck, I was quite good at getting on with stuff. I really wasn't. You get some people that have a spinal cord injury and they go into spinal rehab and they just take it on the chin. They seem to cope with it quite well. That wasn't me. When you break your neck or your back, I think the common misconception is that the worst news you'll hear from the doctor is that you'll never walk again. If someone said to me tomorrow that they could give me one thing back that I've lost since having my injury, the list would be that long before walking would be something that I'd want back. Apart from the obvious things that most people know about paralysis, just give you a few examples. My body thermostat now doesn't work. I know women are naturally colder than men, it's a scientific fact, but I take that to the next level. Because of my injury, I'm unable to sweat. So if I go out in the sun, I just overheat. If I get cold, I can't shiver. My autonomic nervous system isn't functioning properly. It's not connected to my brain. So if I get cold, it takes me a long time to warm up. And one of the other things I have a problem with is my lungs don't work properly. I don't have any intercostal muscles, which are the small muscles in between your rib, in your rib cage, in between your ribs. I have diaphragm breathing only. So if I get a cough or a chest infection, I can't cough properly, and it causes me quite a lot of problems. So I'm constantly living in fear of anyone that's got any sniffles or anything. I'm like, keep away. So yeah, at 16, having to not really be told that, but just experiencing and coming to grips with the stuff that I had to cope with was pretty tough. And I was in intensive care for a month. I was hooked up to a tracheostomy to breathe for me. I had a feeding tube into my stomach. And when I went into the rehab unit, I was pretty down. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to go to physio. Most people that are in that situation need something to pull them through. It can be the want to be or continue to be a good parent for children. It can be a desire to go back to work. It can be sports. For me, it was wheelchair rugby. I was introduced to wheelchair rugby when I was an inpatient. Now, wheelchair rugby is a mixed sport, so men and women play together against each other, but the classification system allows for women to compete on a level playing field with men. We're classified at slightly different classification, lower than men. So I went to my first training session, whilst I was in the rehab unit, I went to experience the game and just to have a look at it. And these guys had similar levels of injury to me, but they had something different. They seemed to have a passion for life. They had a zest for the sport. These guys were living, and I wanted a piece of that. So I took that back with me to rehab, and I got through rehab. I went back to school and got my A-levels, and I fought my way to becoming completely independent before I went back to university, or before I started university. And university is where I found my my rugby team that I could start playing with these guys as a full-time hobby. And I went to my first tournament at Stoke Mandeville Spinal Unit shortly after I'd started playing, and I fell in love with the sport. These guys were incredible. They were doing stuff that I didn't think possible to do in a wheelchair. They made living life with a spinal injury look very easy. And when you have a spinal injury at my level, you're called a tetraplegic. People that break their backs are called paraplegics. I went from being a barely independent tetraplegic to a fiercely independent athlete in the space of a year. And rugby was also a turning point for me, because in my kind of rehab back into life, if you like, I stopped seeing myself as being defined by my wheelchair, and I started seeing myself as being defined by my strengths. And my perceptions of what was possible for me to do with my life changed massively through playing rugby. And it was actually a teammate in rugby that introduced me to track driving. I'd bought my 911, and I went on a track day with a teammate who had a sports car, and I fell in love with that. Similarly to like rugby, it was like a bit of an addiction. And I continued playing rugby, but I did the track days through the course of my career in the GB national squad. But about 2 years ago, my passion for rugby died a little bit, and I needed something different. And as I'd been tracking my cars for about 7 years, I decided that I might like to get my race license. Now, at first, I just thought that I would get my race license and I can put it on my wall with my university degree, something to have achieved. But once I started down that path, it was never going to be just a license. It was always going to be a race. Once I found out how difficult it would be for me to get my license, that decided it for me that would be my next challenge. Normally, for able-bodied people, getting a race license is quite simple. It's much like a driving test in terms of you have a practical test and a written test. For people that drive with hand controls who have disabilities, you have to do a series of hill climb or sprint events, which are time trials against the clock, but in a competitive environment. I had to show that I was safe to drive a car on a racetrack with competition. What I also had to do was a 7-second unaided exit out of my car. So that if the car crashed, set on fire, whatever happens on a racetrack, I wasn't going to be able to I wouldn't be stuck in the car. Now, when I found out about this 7-second exit necessity, I questioned whether I would be able to do this. If anyone has seen a wheelchair user getting in and out of the car, you know that it takes a lot longer than 7 seconds. And it got to the point where I had to question whether this was one of those things that I was just going to have to hold my hands up and say, do you know what, you've got me. I questioned whether my disability was too severe to be able to compete in a race car with able-bodied men. And as soon as I kind of had those doubts, I had to do it for myself to prove myself wrong. I couldn't let it beat me. And I could see myself in my race car. I could visualize it. I knew that I would be able to achieve it. And I kind of held on to that whilst I went through the processes. So I did my sprints, the first of which I finished first in my class. I did my 7-second exit on my second attempt. And 3 days before my first race, my license was rubber stamped and I was ready to go racing. Now 3 days isn't nearly enough time to get ready to race a car on a racetrack in a proper race. My first race was at Brands Hatch, and I had a test day the day before, which was my first ever test day. Now, track days are very simple in their rules. They have rules in which keep the people that participate, normal road drivers, safe whilst participating on the event. The rules are simple. You overtake on the left, you overtake on the straights, and by consent only. Test days are race rules, anything goes. And I guess the magnitude of the event overcame me slightly. And this is the view I had from the inside of my car. That is my car on its side, about to roll over onto its roof. There is a notorious corner at Brands Hatch called Paddock Hill Bend. And as you come up to it, you are meant to carry the speed in, touch the apex, drift out to the side of the track, which is on a downhill slope, and as you get to the edge of the track that starts to go up the other side, usually if you get it right, you'll get all of the grip, and as you hit the compression, your car will stick to the floor and you'll drive up and out. I got to the middle of the corner, the apex, and decided that I was going in too quickly. I did the worst thing I could have done, and I took my hand off the accelerator, which meant that all of the grip for the back of the car was lost. So the car started to spin. And as I started to spin, I went into the gravel trap, and I can remember looking at the wall thinking, I'm going to hit that, and I'm going to hit that pretty hard. But then as the car rotated, the left-hand wheels dug into the gravel, and it started to tip up onto its wheels. Now my boyfriend was in the paddock, and he said he could see the whole of the underside of my car. And I in the car myself, I put my arm out to brace myself. I don't know why, because I'm fully harnessed in. I wasn't going to go anywhere. But I honestly thought we were going over. And by some miracle, I didn't. It kind of teetered on the edge. It sat back down. And I was left facing the track. And as the track was closed, as I was beached in the gravel, as the recovery truck of shame was deployed to pull me out, I kind of thought, this is quite real. And as I limped back to the pit lane to apologise to my mechanics who would be spending their evening picking all of the gravel out of my brake calipers and the underside of my car, I didn't have any more time to prepare. That was it. The next session out was the next morning for qualifying. Needless to say, qualifying was awful. I'd lost all my confidence. I qualified second from last, and I thought, my worst fear is about to be realised. I'm going to finish last in my first ever race. People are going to look at me, and they're going to think, you don't belong here. You're way out of your depth. And this picture says it all, really. I was absolutely petrified. And as I was getting ready for my first ever race, I was sitting in the car with my mechanic reasoning with me that I would be okay. And as I sat in the holding paddock, looking around at all of these men who were all casual, talking to each other, who've been doing it for 25 years, I thought, what are you doing here? You're paralysed from the chest down. Look at all your competitors. You don't belong here. And if I could have physically got out of that car and run away, I would have done. And as I went out onto the track for my formation lap, and I came up to the back of the grid and pulled up into my pit box, second from last, in a car that I'd had specially built for that race series, with a license that had taken me 1.5 years to get. I was no longer the only woman on that grid. I was no longer the only wheelchair user on that grid. I was a racing driver, just like everyone else. And as I looked up for those lights, waiting for them to go out, I thought to myself, do you know what? You've done it. You're here. Now make it count. And as I went racing, I can't even tell you the emotions that I went through and what that felt like to me. And as I pulled over the finish line, having made history as the first female spinal injury to have completed a race, something much more important had happened. I'd finished 12th out of 24 drivers. I was competitive. My lap times were credible. And as I pulled into my garage to a sea of smiling faces, everyone that had supported me, everyone that had got me to the place that I was at that point, that moment will stay with me forever, because I couldn't have got any higher. But it hasn't been easy. I am at the beginning of my second season. I have had races where I've been absolutely ecstatic with my performance, crossed the line in happiness with an attitude of couldn't wait to get back in the car. Likewise, I've had races that I've crossed the line in tears, thinking that I wasn't good enough. I've had spins. This is me losing control of the back of the car at Redgate at Donington. I did regain it. I didn't spin. It was okay. Another spin at Snetterton. I've had crashes. I've had some of the other drivers crash into my car. But do you know what? I've done it. And do you know how I've done it? Because I believed in myself. And do you know why I've done it? Someone told me I couldn't. At the beginning of this year, I was asked to become an ambassador for a new initiative in motorsport, Dare to be Different. It's run by an ex-test driver, Susie Wolff. For those who don't know of her, she used to be the test driver for Williams and has spent all of her career in this male-dominated industry that is motorsport. And when she retired, she appreciated there was a need for something like Dare to be Different that promotes women in motorsport, it supports them, and it encourages more people to become involved. So this initiative has many reasons, but two very important reasons. To get more people of our generation into the industry by promoting them and making women realise that it's accessible. But another more important aspect of this organisation is to get kids, girls, into karting, into motorsports, so that when the teacher says, what do you want to be when you're older? You've got little girls putting their hands up and saying, I want to work with cars. I want to be a racing driver. I want to be a mechanic. And it's the norm rather than the exception. And if we can achieve that, we can start to change history. Now, I was quite surprised when I was asked to become an ambassador for Susie's project, because I don't see myself as a powerful woman. Obviously from my stories, I don't follow the trend. I do things that aren't obviously the obvious choice. When I first started playing wheelchair rugby, I was the only woman who played it for the first year of my rugby career. Racing, I'm the only woman within this paddock. But I don't do this to push social boundaries or challenge gender stereotypes. I do this to push my own boundaries, to challenge myself. I am passionate about what I do, and I'm a strong believer that a successful person is a passionate one. Now, I'd like to show you a clip of a video that Sky did of me for my second ever race at Silverstone. And I'd like you to consider the following when you're watching it. Is it important that I'm the only woman on that video? Is it important that I'm the only wheelchair user amongst all these able-bodied men in my championship? Or is it important that having broken my neck at 16, I followed my dreams and didn't let my physical limitations stop me from doing what I loved?
The adrenaline and the buzz, you can't get it from anything else. Once you're in the car, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what gender you are, if you're in a wheelchair or you're able-bodied, you're just another driver.
A self-confessed speed addict, Natalie McGloin has just been awarded her ARDS racing licence. She's the first British woman with a spinal injury to get one.
I can't explain to you the relief and the excitement that I felt at the same time, but it was also quite a fear then. I was like, I've got this now, and I actually have to do that race next weekend. There's no getting out of this.
As well as the standard exam and sprint races, Natalie had something extra to do.
Basically, you need to be able to make sure that you can exit the car in 7 seconds so that if you have a crash or if your engine blows up on the track, that you are not going to be stuck in the car.
Go.
I can't really explain how I did it because I thought I might need a lot of practice, but it was just a case of getting onto the roll cage and throwing myself out backwards.
At 16, Natalie was a passenger in a road accident and her spine was severely damaged. To allow her to drive at track speeds, Natalie's car has had many modifications.
This lever here is my brake and throttle, so if you can see the pedals are moving, so it's no more complicated than simple mechanics and a rod attached to the accelerator and the brake. So push forward to brake, pull down to accelerate.
This race is the Porsche Club Championship at Silverstone. Natalie came 19th out of 23, not bad for her second ever race.
That was awesome, such a good race. I want to race in the wet all the time now. I come to circuits like this on track days or races and I'm a driver, I'm not a wheelchair user, and you know, I can't get away from the fact that I am, but it's kind of a respect that's on a level playing field, and you don't often get that in other parts of society, so it's good and it's the way it should be.
Jane Diggle, Sky Sports.
Thank you.